Jeff, do you mind following with that UK mineral mix?
Yeah, so the UK mineral mix they're just guidelines that we put together for fescue-based mineral programs, and we don't get anything off of them, no money kickbacks, but they're a formula that any manufacturer can use. So the Kentucky Farm Bureau did take that up, and if you were a Kentucky Farm Bureau member and your county Farm Bureau Association participated in that program, you could get the UKRM minerals. They would do a bulk type of a price. It was actually pretty reasonable, but then other suppliers realized that well, we'll just make kind of very close price on that too. We've also got a spreadsheet that we can use to help the agents have that if you've got 3 or 4 different tags, we can plug it in and give you a comparison of different minerals. So if you got questions on that, just reach out to your county agents and we can help you walk through that. Mineral's the easiest thing to supplement, but it's the hardest thing to figure out what you're actually feeding. So don't go cheap, I'll just say that. All right.
I'm just going to give us a background, and we're going to go into a lot more detail in the second laying out grazing system. Yeah?
All right, thanks, Ray. And so, again, we're going to just cover this real quick. Ray, please make sure and give me a 5-minute notice, too. There's a few things you need to think about with your grazing programs. We're throwing a ton of info. Yep, I wanted to make sure it wasn't. How's that? Is that better? Yeah. All right, there we go. There's a few things that we need to keep in the back of our mind is what are your goals? Everybody's goals are going to be a little different. We're throwing a ton of stuff at you in a short period of time. Don't get overwhelmed with it. Just boil it down, and that's what we're going to talk about is kind of synthesizing through all this. Some of your goals may be to improve grazing distribution. And the reason for that is to improve your grass utilization. And Greg mentioned this in his talk, and we'll continue to discuss this a little bit more, but enhance that manure distribution so you're getting more fertility value out of what these cattle are feeding on. If it's hay, if it's pasture, whatever, the more evenly they're out there on the pastures, the more they're urinating and defecating more evenly and getting better fertilizer value. Ultimately, some of you, it may be increasing carrying capacity. Some of you, it may not be, because you're going to have 5 head and that's all you're going to want to have and you don't want any more. But others, it may be to improve the carrying capacity of the ground to improve profit margins. Improve forage persistency. One of the key things here is rest for replenishing those root reserves. Also making sure that we leave enough photosynthetic material out there for regrowth whenever we pull cattle out of a pasture and move them further. Some of you, it may be to try and improve animal performance, and I will just say that this is one of the biggest limitations we have. There's very little opportunity, to be honest, to improve animal performance without other management things that we implement. Most of the response that you see from improved managed grazing is agronomic. And then those agronomic responses can lead to improved animal performance through maybe getting more clover to be maintained in the stand because we're giving it rest. And that higher digestibility and protein in those clovers will improve animal performance. So it's kind of a give and take. But most of the responses are agronomic. Have realistic expectations. That's kind of my biggest thing. Labor is in short supply for many of you because you've got off-farm employment. Maybe you've got kids that have sports. Maybe you've got grandkids that have sports. And maybe the best you could do is go out there on a weekend and move cattle. Or maybe your system only allows you to move them every 2 weeks. But start small and work up. Don't go out there and build 100 paddocks and try and get a daily move or every 12-hour move or something like that. Ease into this and have realistic expectation. Twice per week is kind of ideal. When I was at Wisconsin, Dane Undersander looked at frequency of moving, and really what they found out is you can go out to about day 4 before you really start getting a lot of regrazing on regrowth. Once you get past day 4, though, you're going to begin to see some selective grazing on that regrowth of those forages. So if you're out there a week, yeah, we're sacrificing a little bit, but it's still better than going 2 weeks. Okay? Pasture improvement takes time. I mentioned this the other day. You could realistically expect to see 3 to 5 years before you start seeing significant improvements. And also, I've mentioned this before, but don't get into this set mindset. I'm always going to be on 6 paddocks, and I'm always going to follow in this exact rotation, and it's always going to be 10 days of rest. Don't do that. It won't work. All right? You have to be flexible. Greg mentioned it. I mentioned it the other day. There's a lot of art in this. We're just trying to teach you the basics, but you'll learn through your pastures and systems what work and what don't work. Adam's going to touch base with you here on land resources, and Jimmy already mentioned this too with the web soil survey data and using it, taking advantage of learning about what kind of soils you have and the potential forage production that you may have. Are they south-facing slopes that are going to start greening up earlier in the spring than north-facing slopes? And you can begin designing your rotations based upon those things too. Livestock groups, you know, we're fall calving right now. And what if that cow went and hid that little calf back over there and it's the day's move and we move those cows? What's going to happen? She's going to jump that poly wire to try and get back to that calf, right? And so sometimes you need to think a little bit about where you're moving groups and what you can do and be flexible and then say, all right, well, maybe during the calving window, I'm going to keep this group of cows here for 30 days in this pasture and make sure there's enough forage for them for 30 days, and then begin my rotation back again. And the rest of the cows that haven't calved, just going to leave them behind. But there's got to be a little bit of thought process that goes into that to make sure that it doesn't become too difficult for you to implement your grazing system. Shade and water is a challenge. Make sure we got plenty of access in the summer to shade from an animal well-being and performance standpoint, and then water is kind of the no-brainer that we talked about already. And then I keep hammering on the forage rest because it really is key, and this period that is required to get regrowth is going to be changing through the growing season. When conditions are ideal, temperatures are ideal, soil moisture is ideal, forages grow really rapidly. When temperatures get above those cool season grass threshold and soil moisture becomes limiting, forage growth slows to almost stops. And so you have to understand that it's not constant. And I think as you look at those forage production curves and you look at the program that Dr. Henning went through, you're going to see forage production curves being developed. Understand that those are kind of basic off of data, but year to year there's going to be variation. Okay, week to week there could be variation. You know, we got 2.5 inches in the last 36, 48 hours. All right, temperatures have fallen, and it's more ideal for cool season growth. But day length in the fall is getting shorter, and so there's less growth that's going to occur there too. So keep those basic things in mind. So we may be out here in the spring and in the fall and being able to only allow 14 days of rest. If we get into midsummer and conditions aren't as ideal, we may need to stretch that out as much as, say, 60 days. And so you need to be thinking about that and trying to make sure that you understand when you get into this that there's going to be situations where, well, it looked really good 3 weeks ago, but now it looks like crap. And it's think about, well, what conditions have changed for forage production. Okay. Rest is really important. On your grazing sticks and in some of the things, we have this formula. It's in the back of the little pocket guidebook. It's in your rotational grazing pub, but it's also still on the grazing sticks. The paddock number is equal to the rest period, this time interval that you want to give the stand to rest, divided by the grazing days that you intend to be in that paddock plus 1. And so as an example, if we wanted 30 days of rest and we were going to be in that paddock for 4 days grazing, then 30 divided by 4 plus 1 equals 8 paddocks. Okay? Most of you are going to be able to do a great job starting out with 4 to 8 paddocks. And you'll begin seeing improvement. And then you may begin building and splitting it up even more as you move along. Water is our biggest challenge in most of our operations, especially we get into some of the rough hillsides. It's pretty difficult to get water in some of those locations, and we realize that. The other day I mentioned the 800-foot rule. This is kind of the ideal situation, all right? But we also know that in range conditions, cattle will go up to about a mile to go to water. So they can walk, okay? But it will also impact forage utilization. Because as they go all the way back up to the water source and they get water, then what are they likely going to do? They're going to loaf close to the water. They're going to continue to graze closer to the water. And so you're going to get overgrazing near the water, and you're not going to get a lot of grazing a mile back. And so that's the whole concept of trying to keep about 800 feet rule, is to improve the forage utilization across the entire pasture. Okay? Temporary systems, Greg mentioned this, we mentioned this yesterday. It really is a great tool to learn where to put waters and where not to have them. Water placement, if you can get it centrally located, that's ideal, because as you think about the distance then from right here to the back of the corner, it's much shorter than from here to the back of the corner. And so cattle are going to utilize this area much more efficiently than they will this area down here. Municipal water, we talk a lot about having municipal water, but I'm still one of the guys that maybe is a bit traditionalist and say, if you've got good clean pond water, or you can develop a spring and you know that the spring is good clean water, it is still an asset to have. And you can get just as good a performance on good clean pond water. Okay, Missouri did some work several years ago that looked at fencing cattle out and giving pond water on fescue compared to well water, and there was no difference between well water and pond water. So that's a good question. If your ponds are green and scummy and muddy, like they can sometimes get, then you need to think about, well, if I'm pulling off of that top 6-8 inch layer, I'm getting a bunch of that pulled in there, right? So if you have cattle that are going into ponds and they're churning up all that mud and silt from the bottom, you're increasing the turbidity in the water, the total dissolved solids. They won't drink much of that. You may see them splashing around and maybe taking a little drink, but watch them, because if you've got a water over there where Ray is and they come out of the pond, probably 8 times out of 10 they're going to go over the water and get a drink. So you can fence them out, and you can keep the water cleaner that way. They're not going to be defecating and urinating and putting pathogens in it that way either. And they need to be deep enough that they stay cool enough and that we don't get a lot of algal blooms. Great question. So we can use copper sulfate as an example to help algae control, right? But then if the cattle are drinking that water, it's going to increase the copper potentially that they're consuming if they're drinking that water. And it can then impact the absorption of other trace minerals like zinc, for example. And so you could induce a zinc deficiency by giving too much copper. Yeah. So what you need to do is you need to kind of think about how much of that copper am I actually putting in and raising the levels up. And it's not that expensive to get a water test. We can send it off to one of our forage testing labs, probably for $20 or less, and get a mineral profile on what the content is. Make sure you read the labels. Yep. So municipal water, I just wanted to give you a rough idea for Woodford County, and I did this a couple years ago. If I had a 50 cow herd, 47 calves, because we're never going to get every cow to have a calf and live, and 2 bulls, running some average consumption of water, looking for months during warm months like July, August, September, this begins to get up here close to $200 a month for these 50 head. This is municipal water, real numbers, and this cost is real. Okay, if you're going through the winter time, it's about half of that. All right, so about $100 a month. And I just put this out there again to be thinking about, the cost of water and why we can still use other sources, but we need to think about working within our CS staff to develop those drinkers and that. Springs are great. We got a lot of springs in the state, but they also can be high in sulfur. So if you smell rotten eggs, that doesn't mean that it's bad. get it tested so that we don't induce a copper deficiency. Sulfur will tie up copper. This is Greg Kalich's farm that I helped him with years ago when we first started out. And each number is a paddock that we developed. Okay, and then you got permanent waters here by blue, temporary water tanks here, and then a spring tank that ran about 9 months out of the year. And the only thing I'm going to tell you is that, so this is our entry into the farm. This is where we would receive feeder calves, and we'd hold them in this area. So we put a permanent water here, and that was a mistake. The short period of time they were here, there's a hydrant right here. We'd run a tank to them anyways. And this one was wasted money, and it shouldn't have been here. It should have been moved. Remember I told you the other day, I can tell you a whole lot more about what not to do than what to do. Each of these little yellow lines is a subdivision fence. Okay, and so this was one big field, and we split it off. We split this down this way mainly because there was some shade issues, and so this helped us balance some shade issues. Here's another permanent tank, and then from this tank we had a hydrant, and we ran that black pipe that you all worked with. And we would run this black pipe down this way, all the way back to this spring tank because that's the only way we could get it. And that was a long run. But the reason we had to do this is this spring tank was not reliable. We could then also, a couple years later, we wound up putting a hydrant in here. And we could put a permanent, actually we put a mirror fountain, we put a hydrant first, and then we put a mirror fountain drinker here. And that served this pasture, this pasture, this pasture. And then times were really tough. We had a horse farm we leased over here. They had a drinker here and a drinker here because there were plenty of water opportunities here on this horse farm. We could also then run water from here across in a temporary tank into this field. And then we could take and run it down to this tank. And then we'd tap in over here and run it down to this tank. And so the point I'm trying to make is that as you begin going through here, don't overlook some of these things as being tools, but don't think they have to be permanent. Because once you get, all right, this was a mistake, this is a drinker, is probably about $500. Sometimes it's just as easy to tap that line off and take and move that to where you need it. And that can be done. It doesn't have to be permanent. If you work with NRCS, you work with Bill Payne and others, and develop your grazing plan, they will help you eliminate making some of these mistakes because they've seen a lot of systems. They have the knowledge to help you lay these things out. Greg mentioned it. I've mentioned it. Start temporary, then move to semi-permanent. Lanes are one of those things, too, to think about. If you put in a subdivision with polywire or even a single strand of galvanized wire, they're going to walk along that fence for a period of time, and what's going to happen is they're going to begin to make a lane. And you get a 2.5-inch rain like we had yesterday, and it came pouring down. It's going to wind up washing those lanes, and then you're not going to have any grass, and year after year that lane is going to get deeper and deeper and deeper. If you take though and you have it somewhat semi-permanent, and which is what we would do, is we just pull those posts and move them 2 feet over and put them back down and minimize the laning effect. It's not that hard to move those things. Electric fence is your friend in these systems. You worked with it yesterday. It makes subdividing really easy. A lot of people talk about even if you just have one strand that's electrified over top of a woven wire, it can become your extension cord because then you can hook into it to electrify your temporary fence. The other thing I learned in Wisconsin from the dairy folks is don't think about polywire as your only temporary fence options. Aluminum wire is super light, it's very bendable, and you can use aluminum wire. A single strand of high tensile with those little Jenny reels, you can spin that stuff back up in pretty much no time. And so there are other ways to use temporary fence besides the polywire if you're looking at those things. The other thing is it needs to be done right. Mr. Lowe, you found out that we're getting feedback, bleed back in our electric fencing system, right? Yeah, and it's a problem, and we know that, okay? And so when you do those things and you've got bleed back and some issues, there are challenges. So Work with somebody knowledgeable like a Jeremy that knows fencing systems. By all means, put the ground rods in, what it calls for, and maybe +1. Account for heat stress. Okay? This is real. Dr. Emerald Phillips mentioned this. Livestock need shade. You don't need anybody coming down your road and taking pictures at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with cows standing there or sheep standing there with tongues hanging out looking miserable today. All right? It's not that expensive to put shade up. We talked about the toxicosis, increasing heat stress. Shade's not required annually in this state because we do have, they don't really need shade today. It's not that hot, and they're going to dissipate the heat load that they build up today through the night. Okay? But it's those really hot periods. Cattle will be heat stressed in March. I can pull out nearly probably 7 to 14 days almost every March where cattle will be heat stressed. Why? They got a full winter hair coat. It jumps up into the 80s a couple days like that, and you'll see them out there panting because they have not acclimated from winter temperatures to summer temperatures. Natural is best. The trees are best because they're up a lot higher and the animal heat load can go up and dissipate and move away, right? Also, if you've got a 30 to 40 foot tree and you think about sun orientation and the shadow length that tree then will cast is pretty big shade area, and it will allow that heat to dissipate and go away. If you don't have trees, when I was in Missouri, they decided, to improve rotational grazing systems and eliminate all that loafing, we'll just cut them all down. Okay, that was not a good thing. Make sure you have adequate trees. 1 tree for every 20 cows eventually is going to become a dead tree because they're going to stand under there. All the feeder roots are relatively shallow, and they're going to trample all that up and churn all that up, and eventually they're going to kill that tree. So make sure you have significant numbers of trees. When you go out to Woodford, look on the right-hand side once we get past all the crop ground. There's a little wooded area, and then it opens up in kind of oak savanna. There's a couple of big old oak trees there. There's plenty of oak trees in that pasture as an example of a good oak savanna, and that's kind of what we want. Multiple trees spaced out in a pasture. I say avoid pines, wild cherry, and other problematic trees. Buckeyes, some oaks, because oaks can be toxic with the tannins. So work with your forester to develop some tree systems. This is what can happen. See how they're damaging right underneath here already? And eventually it's going to turn into that. The other day I talked to you about these little floats that hang on the top of the tanks. You put your water underneath here thinking it's a good idea to keep it cool. They're loafing, they pull that float up, and now you got a flooded mess. What are all the cattle doing for the most part? They're all standing, right? Got one little calf down here laying. They tend to use the edges. And so if you're in a wooded area, you don't have to give them a big area in the woods to get them shade. They're going to want to stay out here to watch for predators. So you can fence off maybe 20 to 40 feet in there and then keep the rest of your woods protected. I'm going to zip back through this. I got about 2 minutes, Ray. 5 minutes, okay. Here's some basic calculations if you're going to build a shade structure to think about. Those cows were mostly standing. If you assume a cow from head to tail is 7 to 8 feet, and if they're 3 to 4 feet wide, if you think about looking at them coming as they're charging you. So you're looking at somewhere around 20 to 30 square feet per head of shade required. But then do you want any space in between them, or are you going to stack them in like dominoes? Okay, so use a little common sense. So maybe 40 square feet per cow and an additional 20 square feet for the calf at its side. So you can go out and then begin thinking about how much shade you're going to have. There's a lot of opportunities. We've got a shade structure example in your binder, and if we don't, we can get it for you. There's a pipe version in there that's on skids that you can move that are basically the ones that are built out here. They make great FFA projects for high school kids. You pay for the pipe, let them learn how to weld, and then bring that shade structure home and put up on your fabric. And then lastly, lanes. They can be permanent or temporary. It helps in moving cattle from parts of the farm, but they can be high traffic, so think about developing those with maybe some geotextile fabric and some gravel in those really high traffic areas. You're going to lose some manure nutrients because they're going to urinate and defecate in those lanes. And so here's an example of a nice developed, and it's coming off of the road from back here, gravel with the traffic from the trucks and that to check on cows, but then not from here back because we can walk back through there, maybe take the UTV or whatever. It's also in the middle where we've got our water because then we can swing these gates across, and when cattle are coming in from this pasture, they can use this area and not muck this up. When they're coming in from this pasture side, they can come in here and then they go back that way. It's a pretty wide lane and they can travel back through there and not damage it too much. And then lastly, try to build your paddocks as square as possible because it saves you on fencing. It takes a lot less fence running it this way than running it this way. There's actually way more fence involved in these 4 paddocks than there is in this one. All right? So as you begin working with what Mr. Jones is going to go through here with you now, think about some of these concepts that we talked about: water, fencing, shade, as you begin looking at the maps that he's going to share with you and thinking about how to divide up a farm. Okay? And think about some of those critical questions that you might have. What am I going to do if one's lame? Do I want a lane to bring a couple head back? Am I going to use a dart gun? There's a couple ways to think about that. All right, I have to run to the diagnostic lab to give a presentation to the vets out there for their continuing ed program, but I will try to make it back this afternoon. Groups 1 and 2. Unfortunately, your heifers decided the grass was greener on the other side of the fence. And surprisingly, they weren't the smallest paddocks. So when you get out there and this afternoon, if I'm not back yet, and you're looking at, did you make your mark? Keep that in the back of your mind that we don't know exactly when they got out, but they didn't stay in all night long.